Sir Keir, big announcements on new COVID restrictions yesterday. Different leaders of different nations have gone in different directions. Do you think Boris Johnson went far enough?
There are obviously different rules now in England, Scotland and Wales, and one of my criticisms of the Prime Minister is that he hasn't held the four nations together, barely had meetings with the leaders in the devolved administrations, and it would be far better if there was one set of rules across the whole of the United Kingdom.
What's your view on households?
On households, I mean, we're supporting the government's rule of 6. Obviously, we'll have to keep it under close review, but I am conscious of not trying to put up a different set of propositions to the government.
The furlough scheme, you want more support for people if they can't get back to work.
As the government is introducing new health restrictions, it's phasing out economic support. Businesses now, as the result of these new restrictions, are going to be put under huge strain, and you owe it to them to put a support mechanism in place. And the government really should have done that yesterday.
Let's move on to your speech yesterday. You talked about the Prime Minister's character in your speech. You said of Boris Johnson that while he was writing flippant columns about bendy bananas, I was defending victims and prosecuting terrorists. While he was being sacked by a newspaper for making up quotes, I was fighting for justice and the rule of law. They're quite personal attacks. You didn't used to make such personal attacks, and what's changed?
Boris Johnson and I are two very different individuals, and I think it's very important that people see and understand that. The Labour Party is under new leadership. It's for me to set out how I will lead the Labour Party. That's what I was doing yesterday.
But you're playing the man, not the ball. I mean, you're criticising him personally rather than the policies, aren't you?
Well, character matters at a time like this. People are looking to the Prime Minister, and they absolutely need the reassurance that he and the government are able to do what's necessary to ensure the infection rate goes down and to do what's necessary to avoid mass unemployment. So at this time, above all else, character matters.
But in your speech yesterday, you said he's just not up to the job. So you do think he's a bad leader?
Well, the Prime Minister and the government collectively are guilty, in my view, of serial incompetence. There have been 12 U-turns. Now, I'm quite prepared to accept that a government will make mistakes in a pandemic like this, and one or two U-turns are probably a sign of a government listening and then changing. But when you've got 12 in a row, the only conclusion is serial incompetence.
You've got a clear strategy when it comes to Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, but what about the SNP? You will never win an election if you can't win Scotland and go back to Labour's winners. Not since 1955, you'll know this, what I'm about to say, has the Labour Party formed a government with less than 40 seats in Scotland. How many seats do you have in Scotland now?
Well, look, I'll be perfectly open about this. There is no route back for Labour that doesn't run through Scotland.
How many seats
It's why
do you
I was
have
in Scotland. It was because, well, we've got one.
And what do you offer Scottish people that might get you another 39 seats? Will you rule out an independence referendum, as Boris Johnson's done, clearly?
What I was discussing last week in Scotland with Scottish Labour was the importance of rebuilding the economy in Scotland.
What's your position? Do you rule out another referendum in Scotland?
We will be making the argument, going into that election next May, that this is not the time for another divisive independence referendum in Scotland.
Do you see this?
There are other priorities.
Do you see this, as we talked about when it came to Brexit, as a matter that should have been settled for a generation, not having another referendum in Scotland?
Well, I'm simply saying that another divisive referendum is, I think, about the last thing that we need.
In January, you said if the SNP won a majority in the Holyrood election, they would have a mandate for that, for a second referendum. I accept this is a question for Scotland. Do you stand by that principle?
I'm concentrating at the moment on the argument that we need to make between now and next May, where I say there are other priorities.
I understand that, but I'm asking you not about the election in May, I'm asking you about the principle. An SNP majority gives them a mandate for a referendum. In January, you said that you would accept it's a question for Scotland if the SNP win that majority. Do you, in principle, stand by what you say in January, or do you want to move away from that?
Well, we're going into an election in May where we will all set out our positions, and the Labour Party position will be... But
what is the
happens,
Labour Party position? What you said in January?
What happens beyond that is hypothetical, and
Sir Keir, you're dodging the question.
In politics, people say with great certainty what's going to happen, who's going to win, what they're going to do, what's going to happen afterwards.
I'm not asking you what's going to happen. I'm asking you whether you stand by what you said in January when you said they would have a mandate for that.
Well, these issues are questions for Scotland. I do stand by that. I'm setting out the argument that the Labour Party, Scottish Labour, will be making between now and next May.